It's now my great pleasure to introduce Craig Roque, who is a Jungian analyst and psychotherapist trained in London. His practice since 1987 has been in Sydney and Alice Springs, where he's been involved in Indigenous mental health services since 1992. His writings are concerned with the challenge to an application of psychotherapeutic principles in complex local Indigenous settings. He's collaborated on several CASSE projects. Publications include The Cultural Complex, Explorations in Psychoanalytic Ethnography, The Geography of Meanings, Growing Up in Central Australia, On Ceremony, and with Utul Eichelkamp, and the award-winning graphic novel The Long Weekend in Alice Springs, and a series of hybrid performance events at Alice Springs on themes of intoxication, Sugarman, law, death, and regeneration. Craig has collaborated with CASSE on some work together, and his collaboration is deeply thoughtful, deeply ethical, imaginative, marked by an integrity of cross-cultural practice and grounded in years of experience. It's been a privilege to work with him, and I have great pleasure in introducing him.
You made that very clear, the fact that there is, in a way, in Alice, 2 or 3 networks, and that is the people such as with Kenny's mob, Peter, this group here, who are really, who live and work in each other's backyards, really. But there's another group who love putting up very big buildings and love changing the fabric of that relationship in terms of I'm going to call it the industrialisation of the Australian brain. And because we're in the brain centre, I'd like us to think of this recognition event as a neurological problem, a brain problem. It is a political problem, but before that, it's how we think. Pangata, it's how we think together. It's how we think. And you'll see on the screen a landscape. People who've lived and operated in that landscape for quite a long time learn to think according to that landscape. And there are others who think in terms of patterns. Landscape patterns, and then, if I get this right, graphic patterns, patterns that represent the thinking. In this case, this is by a painting called Thinking About the Future by Kumanjay Jabaljari Spencer. This I'm showing to you now because it's an example of Pinnaby Warlpiri pattern thinking. But there are others in this room who are familiar with this kind of pattern thinking. Here is a beautiful room in Vienna. For those of you who haven't been to Vienna, this is the consulting room of Dr. Sigmund Freud. You can see on the shelf at the back artifacts from European, Greek, Mediterranean history. Freud was a custodian of culture. And you see here artifacts from the Western Desert of equal significance and power. And here you see the carpets, which at that time you could afford to buy in Vienna, but I guess there's about $50,000 worth of carpets there on Freud's floor. And if you went for psychoanalysis, Here, if you went to Nunkari Dr. Freud, he'd lie you down there and he'd sit in this little chair. But if you go to some of the Western Desert Nunkari, you just lie down on the ground or maybe on the back of a truck or somewhere. We do have, both of us, the Nunkari or the healing tradition, but the way we approach it and the way we think of it are quite different. And many of us who work together in Central Australia are struggling with how we think about death and how we think about cure and how we handle these things. And one of the people who helps us is another painter, this one. Give me a chance. Here. This is a painting by Rod Moss. Lives in Alice Springs. I'm going to show you four of his paintings, because in his portraits, he kind of shows us life and events in Alice Springs in much the same way as Kieran's photographs and Kieran's work in the newspaper documents the portraits of life in Alice Springs. So here you have, for those of you who may not recognise it, Dr. Freud on the couch. And who is his doctor? Old Mr. Hayes up here, who's having a really good time listening to Freud's dream. I would really like to know, Tim, what you think Patrick Hayes is listening to as he's hearing Dr. Freud tell his dream. And here are some of the artefacts. There are some of the artefacts. There's the view of the ranges, Alice Springs outside. There's one of the Coolaman there. Well, we haven't got Coolaman here, but we've got some of the other objects. What's Rod doing? He's showing in his own painting the effort to bring things together. And there are the men over here who are part of this effort of bringing things together. Jamie, Nathan, Jugadai. This is going on all the time in this town, but it gets built over by the Supreme Court. Now I'm going to take you to this painting. This is another painting by Rod Moss. He calls it The Intervention Angel. It was painted in 2007. I'd just like to read to you what Rod says about this painting himself. Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. The painting's title is a reference to the Howard government's 2007 emergency intervention in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. But nothing short of divine intervention would be needed to reverse the consequences of settler impact on Indigenous people. And something akin to the miracle birth would be required to imagine the ongoing viability of Aboriginal settlements and perhaps even Indigenous culture and identity in general. Rod has based this image on a painting of Caravaggio, his Nativity, painted in 1609. But here we have the little children. The little children are sacred was the name of the report, translated rather incorrectly into English. And there is the Indigenous family, and there is the angel coming down, and there are the people and the dogs and the camp. But I want to say a couple of things while you look at this painting. Because Kenny, as you know, Much of this so-called recognition, I'm going to call it the recognition zone now. The contact zone is true, but it's not only contact between people, it's also recognition, a psychological, seeing people, hearing people. So I'm going to call it the recognition zone. Those of you who here are of a psychological or psychotherapy interest, please try to develop this idea or this concept. It's about how we think. The challenge to Australians and to Pintupi and to Warlpiri and to Amajara and to Aranda is how we think together. But you see, there is a profound difference in the thinking as I have understood it. And one of the first layers of thinking we must attend to is what is sometimes called magical thinking. Now, magical thinking, and is closely related to poetic thinking, magical thinking is where cause and effect do not follow the logic of contemporary, rational, scientific human beings anywhere in the world. If you understand magical thinking, you will understand more, you don't have to agree with it, but you will understand more how death is caused. You will come to appreciate how the causes of death in Indigenous Australia, I'm going to come around the other side in a minute, how the causes of death do not seem to follow the logic of the courts or evidence or biology. The other form in which magical thinking requires attention is cure and disease and illness. So when Ngangkari, the traditional healers, who I know and are associated with, look for the cause of an illness, they do not go directly to the biology, but they tend to go to what the psychotherapists would call the psychological causes. There are shifts in understanding of cause. And when you understand how the Ngangkari is diagnosing and defining what the illness is, if you think of it from the point of view of a psychotherapist, and also acknowledge what we'll call magical or poetic thinking, it makes perfectly clear sense as to how the diagnosis and the treatment develops. But it is extremely hard in the Northern Territory Health Service to have Ngangkaris recognised, traditional healers recognised, and the diagnostic and treatment method recognised, even though we have people here in this room who work in that frame. So for me, this reconciliation, recognition also includes full recognition of the traditional healing methods of the Central Australian people. And I could say more about that too. The third thing that we should look at in terms of magical thinking is love. There are two aspects of love. One is love for country, with country, and the way in which the country loves us. It's a relational business, Ken, as you've said. But then people say, but how can the country love someone? This is not logical. How can the country come out and hold and speak to someone? Well, it happens, I can assure you. But if you want to understand more about Indigenous thinking and the way the left brain and the right brain and the corpus callosum is constructed in Central Australian people, you have to seriously investigate love of country and country-loving people. Then you can get on to sex magic and all that exciting and interesting stuff. And definitely there's a magical thinking that's in terms of relationships. And the magical thinking also leads us to another area which is called cause and effect. Cause and effect in death, the attribution of causes of deaths, whether by accident or direct murder or manslaughter. The attribution of causality in terms of healing and diagnosis, attributions of causality in terms of love and the capacity of country to love. These three aspects require the Westerners to study and comprehend. And then perhaps you will have a sense of what is possible in terms of psychological recognition. That's all I'll say about that one. That's really a university degree subject. Now I want to go to the next painting. Oh no, I have to say one thing. I have to say magical thinking. The government of Australia is completely corrupted by magical thinking. A politician or a bureaucrat believes that when he or she thinks something, then that is what will happen and the Aboriginal people will be governed. And then when it turns out that the Aboriginal people are not quite so easily governed just because Malbrough or John Howard or Malcolm or Tony thought something should happen, they discover that it doesn't happen, then they get very upset and then begin to build large constructions in order to govern. Whereas if only they had have listened in the beginning, if only the men who you'll see from 1993 who were formulating and proposing the way in which the justice system could collaborate, and I'll show you the photograph, if only the government would stop thinking their own thoughts and come and actually listen to the people who have been existing in this turmoil for generations, but certainly the last 3 or 4. But they are almost always the people who are not listened to when it comes to the point of actually establishing the reconciliation process. It is the people like the Ryder family and the Kenny family and Jugadai's family who have lived through all this shit and know what it's like to be in the shit. But how strange it is that in the magical thinking of so many of the government and departmental people, many of whom are, good people, simply seem to be unable to listen to anything outside the sphere of the government consultation so-called system. I had to say about that, I won't say any more. Now I want to show you an example. Here is a meeting that took place in 1993. Many of these very senior men have now passed away, except a couple there. But what you see are a number of Aboriginal police officers who are also very senior and significant men in traditional law, meeting with some of the older men, in this case a men's meeting at Mission Creek, and a few other younger men. And I took the photograph. And this was part of a long process that was developing in 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996 in relationship with the Northern Territory government to try to establish an understanding of the limits but also the uses of customary law. And then the whole thing just went down the drain. And all the promises and the negotiations that were established, Warlpiri mostly, fell apart. And now, of course, the Yuendamu, the Warlpiri group, is still in a turmoil because the law was, the potency of the capacity to act within customary law was pulled out as it were, a rug from underneath. I'm showing you this to make it quite clear to you that the senior Indigenous men and women have been working on these problems for decades. Now, what's spread out in front of these men is the prototype of this painting. And this painting is done by Jabalyari Spencer, who's sitting there, relative of Jugadais. I want to spend a little time on this painting to sort of so you can get the understanding of how, in this case, Jabalyari Spencer, who painted this, is thinking about the future. How am I doing for time? Doesn't tell me now. You have to tell me when I'm getting close because the clock stopped. So I want to show you this painting that comes from Western Desert. It represents the area from which the men, the Jula, are from. Up here, this is a representation. This is the Pinnapi section up here. This is representing the Walpuri, Amudjara, Aranda, Pitjantjatjara, Nunatjara, and then kind of southern Aranda. But in Spencer's painting, he's showing here groups of men from all parts of the country coming together to think together about the contemporary issues. Now, Spencer has very specifically made this white and black. White, Karia and Yapa, sitting together, looking at the problem. I'm not going to go into all the problem there. It relates to alcohol, it relates to law issues, it relates to diabetes, it relates to hospitalisation, it relates to early deaths, it relates to the disintegration of the contemporary situation as he saw it and sees it in his painting. Behind, you can see Jugapa tracks, Altura tracks, Jugapa tracks, which he's placed in here to make it quite clear to everybody that all these groups, the Pinnapi, southern, eastern, Walpuri. I don't know why he did the Walpuri so small. I mean, usually when Walpuri paint, they make the Walpuri really big, but I think he did this one out of diplomatic because he didn't want the people to think that because he was Walpuri, he was making the Walpuri most important Kenny, I think. That's why it's smaller. So here's his representation of Jugapa. And you will have heard one of the Tingari songs, the Pindapi Jugapa, the travelling songs that links together so much of the country out west. But these are the two bits I have to bring to your attention. Here and here. This is a representation by Spencer of the five significant aspects of cultural law. What holds the mind of Pindapi, Walpuri, Aranda, Amudjara together? What holds the mind together? The main elements are this. You look at this psychologically, Tim. 1, relationship with kin. Different words in different languages. Walcha is one of them, Wallach is another variation. Relationship with kin. The entire family kinship system that governs Central Australia is of such an intricate, mathematical, complex and beautiful system as a system. The second, there's 2, 3, 4. I don't have to point at every one of them. The kinship system. The relationship with country, depending upon what your language is. The relationship of the human being with the country, if so long as that is maintained, the integrity of the human spirit, the psyche is maintained. When it becomes disintegrated, of course, in these circumstances, there is tremendous stress on the and psychological stress. The third is Jukupa. And Jukupa, the story, different terms, Altura, different terms, but this really relates to the integrity of the cultural stories that hold the mind and the relationships of people together. Everybody has Jukupa. Whether you're Irish, the Irish have Jukupa. Even the British have Jukupa. Even if it's a sort of empire-building Jukupa with a queen in the middle. But it is Jukupa. It's the story system that holds your mind and your direction and your ambition together. When you lose your Jukupa, then that's when the psychological disintegration begins. And then another one there, which he refers to, which is connected to this word over here, kurana, but it can also be kurunpa. It can different languages, different, but it really relates to the sense of one's own spirit or soul, or if you want to be a psychoanalyst, you'd probably talk psyche, but the individual aspect, psyche, which is different to psyche in relation to country and kin, which is a much more complex system. And that's held together by two elements in Japaljarri's effort here to describe in simple terms. One, the whole thing is held together by a notion of carrying care for all of this. These guys carry care for Jilura. They carry care for Jukupa. The carrying of care, Kanyini, Kanyenjaku, different languages, is essential elements. Without carrying care, the whole thing falls apart. But, and this is Japaljarri's again version, what you notice around here is a kind of rope which binds together. And the binding together is the binding together by the law, by law. As I understand it, in the way he has described it to me several times, many times actually, is these things are not bound, these things will not hold together if they are not held together by law. But that is exactly the problem that's been undermining our cultural groupings in Central Australia over these last 50 or more years, because the law has, the power of the law, the binding power of the law has been disintegrated and pulled apart and then replaced by the Supreme Court. Nothing wrong with the Supreme Court except its height and everything, and the fact that there's no lawn out the front. But the problem is the recognition of customary law, traditional law, is so essential to the psychological integrity of any people. Now, in this painting, I don't know how long I've got, in this painting of almost, you can see Japaljarri Spencer's, sorry, go back a little bit please, George, thank you. You see Japaljarri Spencer's picture here, which is the same elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the central one, plus another. And the other is Karia. The other is the white people. And he's saying, I recognise that there is, from now on, there will be a significant new element in our life in Australia, and that is number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The presence of the Australian, European, Asian mentality, culture, money, bureaucratic system. I mean, you could add it all in. But what he did not put into that painting is the law, that which bounds together. And many times Japaljarri had said in conversation with me and many others, I cannot see into the future what will hold us together. But it's CASSE and others who are trying so carefully to find how to hold us together. Next. This is another picture by Rod. It's based, for those of you who know your European Jukupa, it's based on the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus made a really bad mistake. He offended the law, he offended Jukupa, in the Greek Jukupa. The gods were very upset with him, and he was condemned to be forever rolling a big rock up to the top of a hill, then it rolled all the way down again. And he had to get up next morning and start all over again. Rod painted that picture because that's how he feels, I think, a lot of the time. But he's also pointing it there, in this case it's a young Aboriginal man, he knows we're all rolling shit uphill. This is not a job that can be done once, it's done again and again and again. Of course, it goes the other way, in which so many of the Australian bureaucratic political people say, this Aboriginal problem is so hard, it's like pushing shit uphill. It is. Maybe we might have to go back to look at what it was that put Sisyphus in that situation that he was punished, what he'd offended against, that put him into this situation that he's always endlessly repeating the same action. I recommend you look into the story of Sisyphus and find out what he did wrong. Now, to me, this is my almost final picture. This is a psychiatrist, Marcus Tabard, who works with remote mental health. He's a colleague of mine and many other people here. He goes out to, Unimer, Kintor and so on. But what you have there is a picture of Jabberjari Spencer before he'd passed away, and his wife has said to show this of him at work is a good thing because it'll make people remember what the older men have been doing. And they're looking at a painting together. It's called Eagle and Crow. Kanka Wallawaru. It's a story of a man who has to make a choice as to whether he's going to follow the path of the crow, which tends to be, violence, alcohol, shit, rubbish kind of life, or he follows the eagle, which is his totemic Wallawaru, and whether he's going to follow that. It's a really beautiful story, but the point of this is here is an example of what I will now call recognition zone. Here are two men sitting down at an Aboriginal town camp, thinking together about how to approach the solution of a young man who is currently in the mental hospital and how they can help him and his family begin to organise a slightly better choice than the process he'd been through. Now you look at that, and for me that's an image also of the Jillara mob, that they too, black and white, Nathan rabbiting it away in some foreign language. He can't speak English, you know that. Doing the best they can to establish a ground of recognition between each other. Now, last picture. Here's a reference, again, another one of Rod's pictures. There are three good bits from Jesus to think about. Actually, one's not from Jesus. One is the phrase from Paul, now we see in a glass darkly. But then again, or then in the future or later, we will see more clearly. And the title of my talk is A Glass Darkly. And it's related to that injunction. We do see in a glass darkly. Maybe we'll soon clean the glass a little bit more. The second one is this one, which is based on a painting called The Woman Taken in Adultery. And that was where Jesus was tricked. Well, they didn't trick him, but a woman was taken, was caught in the act of adultery. The priests, lawgivers of that time, wanted her to be stoned because that she had to be rocked. And you see here that in the story that Jesus knelt on the ground and began to draw on the ground. And then he said to the people, "You who is without sin, cast the first stone." And here you see Rod's version of this. Here's a well-known Aranda man drawing on the ground. Here are the men ready with rocks in their hands to address this woman here, a white woman. So she's not taken in adultery herself, it's something else. And here are these young men and other men here. They're trying to negotiate a land deal in Alice Springs. Some want it to be used for we'll call it town purposes, and the men here don't want it to be used. And there's, as it were, emerging a kind of conflict here about, represented by the woman taken in adultery. Who is the adulteress? Who is going against the law? How can we protect and preserve our town, but also the sacred sites? And here, writing on the ground. But what you find, as Kieran has told us, is so much of the discussion in Alice Springs about land use, sacred sites, Aboriginal law, recognition, crime, whatever. It gets put into those terms like the Pharisees and the priests in the Bible. Argument, contest, conflict, and efforts to disparage, to put down, to denigrate people such as Doris, the traditional owners, who plead, let us look after our country. So this is partly Rod's response to that. Those of you who criticise, those of you, white people or black people, who criticise the other, think about what Jesus said. Those without sin cast the first stone. Last one is this. Some of you will know Marlene Nampijinpa. She lives in Kintul. She's the wife of Andrew Spencer. Here she is sitting, just having helped Jabal Jari finish that painting, the Eagle and Crow, the one I showed you. You know her. You know what she's done for the diabetes. You know how many children she looks after. You know how hard she has to work. You know how the money comes and goes. You know how she goes, to New York to help negotiate on the Pintupi, some of the Pintupi film and photography there. Her mother is Nancy Nangala. At the age of 20, Nancy Nangala was picked up by truck and brought in, so-called brought in. Marlene remembers when she was 4 or 5 years old, Pintupi, before having seen white people. That's in the lifetime. You got that? That's in the lifetime. Here is a woman whose childhood was spent full on Pintupi bush. Her mother and her brother picked up, and they're both called helicopter. Actually, Nancy's passed away, but both called helicopter because they got picked up by helicopter and brought in, so-called brought in. My point really is this. How could you not recognise Marlene Nampijinpa? How could you look at her history and the history of her husband and her family and not recognise her? How could people like this, who are making continuous contribution to their family and to the maintenance of sanity and stability, how could you not recognise her? That's my story.